Hello everybody. Today we are going to start with the first session of Bridge course. Day 1, Module 1. Title of the Module 1 is Taxonomy. Under this title, we are going to study or we are going to take up the topic Introduction to Taxonomy. Let me introduce myself. I am Dr. Meena Punja. And I'm going to take up your module 1 of taxonomy. Earth today is home to more than 8 million different species. This number is constantly changing, however, as new species are discovered at an outstanding rate. You can see these species getting clustered in an area. Biologists called taxonomists have devised a carefully developed scheme to organize these innumerable species. All organisms in the living world are classified and named according to an international system of criteria that dates to the early part of the 20th century. Of course, the rules of classification establish a procedure to be followed where a new species is identified and named. The rules of classification applies only to formal scientific names, not to common names. Taxonomists classify organisms in a way that reflects their biological ancestry. Because the ancestral relationships are complex, the taxonomic schemes are also complex, and often the subject of taxonomy needs a revision. Despite this complexity, the taxonomic system provides considerable insight into the unity and diversity of life. Dear students, the term classification stands synonymous with the word taxonomy. We all must be now curious to know what is taxonomy. The term taxonomy was developed from two Greek words. Taxis, meaning arrangement, and nomia means distribution or methods. In simple words, the definition of taxonomy is a branch of science that deals primarily with the description, identification, nomenclature, and classification of organisms. It is essential to classify living organisms into different groups and subgroups. So in short, taxonomy is the branch of biology that studies the naming, arranging, classifying, and describing organisms into groups and levels. Now you would ask me, why classify organisms? Classifying organism basically tells us about the pattern in nature, the way organisms are related, how they are evolved. Classification of any organism helps us to identify organisms that are more important to us, like unless and until we know the pest, unless and until we know the pathogen that is entering into our body, we cannot decide, or we cannot take up a treatment, or we cannot fight against it, because we have to study the entire relationship of these parasites with the surrounding, including humans. Classification intended to reflect the evolutionary relationships among organisms, both living and extinct. Practice of identifying different organisms, classifying them into categories, and naming them. All organisms, both living and extinct, are classified into distinct groups with other similar organisms, and they are being given a scientific name. Thus, taxonomy is the methodology and principle of systematic botany and zoology, and sets up arrangements of kinds of various plants and animals in hierarchies of superiors and subordinate groups. This also includes fungi, algae, microorganisms, and so on. Biologists, however, have attempted to view all living organisms with equal thoughtness and thus have devised a formal classification. A formal classification which provides the basis for a relatively uniform and internationally understood nomenclature, thereby specifying cross-referencing and uh, uh, revitalizing the information. So there is a process where they can easily retrieve the information after knowing the formal name or the scientific name of any organism. Now the question arises, that how exactly can we define taxonomy? As so far, we are now confident that taxonomy can be defined as the practice of identifying different organisms. We categorize them, that is, classifying them into various categories, and ultimately give them a formal name. So, if we are being asked about defining taxonomy, taxonomy is the practice of identifying different organisms, classifying them into categories, and naming them. The definition of taxonomy has, it in biology vary from one source to another. Different authors have different point of view regarding taxonomy in biology. Like, for instance, Egoff and Seaborg in 2006, they defined taxonomy as taxonomy involves 7 different types of processes. This is description, naming, recognition, comparison, and classification of taxa, genetic variation, identifying specimens, and defining taxa in the ecosystem. On the other hand, Jude and his associates in 2007, they described taxonomy as the practice of making groups of organisms into species and arranging those species into larger groups and assigning names to the group to produce a classification. while Simpson in 2010 defined taxonomy as the field of science including units of systematics to enclose the identification, description, classification, and nomenclature. Lawrence in 2005 defined taxonomy as an analysis of an individual's characteristics to classify them. On the other hand, Walker in 1988 defined taxonomy as the study of the classification of living beings and their formation of species, and vice versa. While Crick and his associates, they said taxonomy is biology which allows the arrangement of living organism into classification. So based on different definitions, the taxonomy is considered as a sub-branch of systematics or a synonym of systematics. It is also thought the biological nomenclature is either a part of taxonomy or a unit of systematics. What would be the basis of classification? Classification basically involves behavioral, genetic, and biochemical variations. Characterization, identification, and classification are the main processes of taxonomy. Organisms are classified into similar categories, namely kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Groups of organisms with similar characteristics are characterized into species. Species are distinguished based on the morphological characters. There are millions of species in nature, and hence it is difficult to identify and classify those species without having a proper procedure. How does this work? The main aim of grouping organisms depending upon the various classification basis, uh, it is according to their evolutionary relationship, which we commonly call as phylogeny. It establishes the studying of phenotypes, that is, the external characters in the form of anatomy, morphology, and so on of living organisms or fossils. It also concentrates on the genetic makeup, that is, the genotype. DNA sequencing compares the genotypes of various organisms. Now, using these characteristic features of genotype and phenotype, the specific characters and their specific genetic composition, the organisms are grouped into various categories. For example, certain important characteristic features like the feature of feathers. So all those animals with feathers, they are categorized into birds, or we commonly call them as birds. We don't call a dog as a bird, but we call dog as a mammal, cow as a mammal, or cattle as a mammal, and snakes and tortoise and turtles as reptiles. Why? Because they have certain characteristic features which make them different from the others. Like one, as it is seen on the screen, that's the feather. Taxonomist decides which are the most significant or the important characters, by the way they occur in different groups of organisms. That's the reason why when we are saying birds, we relate it with the feathers. When the moment we say mammals, we relate it to mammary glands or the external pinna or so on. And when we relate it to amphibians, it immediately reminds us that the animals are capable of living a dual life. That is, they can survive under the water as well as they can survive on the land. So each characteristic feature, which is the most significant characteristic feature, is considered to categorize the numerous organisms into smaller groups which share the characters. This categorizing or classification is the basis of binomial classification. In today's lecture, I'm not going to touch much upon binomial classification because this is going to come upon when we are going to study various systems of classification. So this is one of the systems that we are going to enlighten in our lecture, in the upcoming lectures, that is the binomial classification. Just for understanding what is binomial classification, we'll just have an superficial understanding about it. The term itself says binomial. Binomial means two terms. This is a naming system which involves two terms, and it is also called as binomial nomenclature or binary nomenclature, which means two term naming system or two name naming system. Biologists from all over the world follows a uniform set of principles for naming the organism. And this set is dependent or it is accepted internationally. There are two major international codes which take up the namings or the classification that are brought about by the biologist over the entire world for the naming protocol. These two codes are International Code of Zoological Nomenclature (ICZN) for animals and the International Code of Nomenclature that is Botanical Nomenclature, which was which is currently called as International Code of Nomenclature for Algae, Fungi and Plants (ICNAFP). which basically deals with the biological nomenclatures of plants, algae, fungi, and so on. These codes make sure that each organism gets a specific name, and that name is globally identified. That's how, if we are talking about a tiger may have n number of local names. But when you say when you are saying an animal, Panthera tigris, so it's uniform. Worldwide, when you use this name, everybody understands that you are talking about the striped cat, that is the striped big cat tiger. So here also it means the same, that it is a uniform, globally identified name. The naming follows certain conventions. Each scientific name has two parts. The first part of the name, that is the generic name, identifies the genus to which the species belong. Whereas the second part, that is each scientific name, after the generic name is followed by the specific epithet. This identifies the species within the genus. The binomial nomenclature, which is the formal system of naming species, giving each one the name that is composed of two parts, uses Latin grammatical forms. although they can be based on words from other languages. But globally, it has been agreed to be used in the Latin grammatical form. Such a name, which is called a binomial name, a binomial name, or a scientific name. More informally, it is also called a Latin name. And the application of binomial nomenclature is governed by various internationally agreed codes of rules, of which these two are the most important. That is, ICZN, International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, and ICNAFP, that is International Code of Nomenclature for Algae, Fungi, and Plants. Although the general principles underlying binomial nomenclature are common to these two codes, there are some differences both in terminology they use and in their practical rule. There are particular rules that varies when these two binomial nomenclatures are used. Now, some may say that why this binomial nomenclature is important. As stated previously, there are millions of species of organisms distributed throughout the world. The same organism are known by different names around the world, as I said, the local name, which may vary from state to state, city to city, and so on. And this can confuse, it can cause confusion when trying to identify or classify. Hence, binomial nomenclature is a valuable solution to this problem. Taking an overview of today's lecture, what we understood about taxonomy. Taxonomy basically is defined as the classification of biological organisms. The classification of organism has various hierarchical categories. Categories gradually shift from being very broad and including many different organisms to very specific and identifying single species. With each step down in classification, organisms are split into more and more specific groups. Taxonomy is not a perfect science. And as you will find out, there is a lot of disagreement and uncertainty about the structure of taxonomic classification. However, taxonomy is a great way to quickly learn about how an organism slots into the tree of life. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.